I'm Cara Santa Maria, and this is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where's the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 69, of the Naked Mormonism podcast. This is the Serial Mormon History Podcast. Today is Thursday, September 21st, 2017. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. On this episode, we catch up with the Quorum of the 12 Apostles to see how their missionary efforts were developing in Europe prior to their departing England to make their way back to Nauvoo. They got in some sightseeing, and they, of course, spare no detail in reporting everything back to the brethren on the other side of the pond. We continue to dive into a number of newspaper articles covering the Mormon expansion efforts. To round out the history for today, we feature a debate between a skeptic and a Mormon apologist, but it's not what you'd expect. After that, we'll be talking to Mike, who just posted an interesting analysis on the ExMormon subreddit, comparing Utah to the socialist utopia of Norway. At least somebody listened to the teachings in the Book of Mormon about socialism and wealth. Last episode, we read a letter that Joe sent to the Quorum of the 12 who were still on their mission in Europe. And he told them to come home, but he also told them to leave a few brethren there to direct church affairs. Since Joe had sent them out on this mission in late 1839, they'd been doing God's work on the other side of the pond, and we've only briefly checked in with them a few times during this mission, reading just a few letters of correspondence between them and the leadership in Nauvoo from time to time. In that same letter, Joe alluded to anti-Mormon sentiments, which were slowly arising in England in response to the mission preaching, and those assertions weren't baseless. The Quorum of the 12 Apostles were making significant progress in converting and baptizing people, and for every person baptized, 2 angry Christians were left in their wake, balking at the fanaticism and stupidity of the Mormon delusion. So let's catch up with the Quorum to see how things were progressing and how the European citizens were reacting to their preaching. With that bit of milk to appetize our historical hunger, let's partake of some meat to satiate said hunger.
As the scriptures say, they must have milk before meat.
Preaching and dunking people weren't the only things the Quorum of the 12 Apostles were doing in Europe. In addition to all of their proselyting, they were doing a fair bit of sightseeing and reporting on their findings. So let's begin with reading a few extracts from the history of the church about what they were doing on their P-days before we get to their actual proselyting campaign and, of course, the public reactions to how quickly Mormonism was spreading. The first bit we'll read are snippets from a letter sent by Heber C. Kimball, Wilford Woodruff, and George A. Smith to the brethren in Nauvoo, and it's dated the 28th of October, 1840. This is taken from the Dan Vogel History of the Church, Volume 4, page 228. Quote, "We will, on this occasion, make a few extracts from Elder Woodruff's journal concerning certain places which we visited. On the 21st of August, 1840, we visited the monument erected in commemoration of the dreadful fire of London in the year 1666, built under the inspection of the great architect Sir Christopher Wren. In addition to these were hundreds of churches, chapels, spires, and monuments, standing in the midst of one universal dense mass of brick and stone buildings covering about 6 square miles of ground. While viewing this scenery in a clear day, and beholding the streets and bridges crowded with human beings of every rank and station, and with beasts and vehicles of every kind, and the Thames covered with shipping from the skiff to the man of war, a Prussian traveler, a citizen of Berlin, who was standing by our side, exclaimed, quoting this traveler, "I have traveled over Europe and Asia and all other parts of the world, but I have never before found a spot upon the face of the earth which presented to my view as grand a scenery as the one now lying before us." Now back to the letter. On the first day of September, we visited the Thames Tunnel by descending about 80 feet into the earth on the south side of the river and entering the archway on the left, which was finished 1,120 feet, and was beautifully lighted up with gas. We walked through it under the Thames, with the river and shipping over our heads. On the 24th of August, we visited St. Paul's Cathedral, which was first built by St. Augustine in the year AD 610. It was destroyed by the fire in 961 and rebuilt the following year. It was not till the reign of Athelstan that London became the metropolis of England, and it was to this prince, more perhaps than to any of his predecessors, that the Cathedral of St. Paul was indebted for its permanent establishment and preeminence. On the 5th of December, we visited Westminster Abbey, which composed of 11 chapels, and then they tells of a whole bunch of other stuff in Westminster Abbey. In walking through this abbey, we see frequent marks of violence from Oliver Cromwell in defacing some of the tombs, monuments, and brasswork with which some of the abbey was adorned. While speaking on this subject, we would not pass over our visit to the House of Parliament, which is but a few rods from the abbey. As we entered the House of Lords, we did not behold so much to interest the sight of the eyes as the meditation of the mind. However, we had the privilege of resting ourselves by sitting in the chair in which the Speaker of the House of Lords had sat for many years. While retiring from this scenery, we had a view of British soldiers or foot guards while on parade in St. James Park, accompanied by a band of music. Also of the Queen's Horse Guards, well mounted upon black horses, the bodies of the men covered with steel which glistened in the sun. We have visited the British Museum, which contains a vast number and quantity of Egyptian sepulchres, mummies, hieroglyphs, and papyrus, the history and account of which we feel much interested in, and may forward you an account of the same in a future communication. We subscribe ourselves your brethren in the new and everlasting covenant. Signed, H.C. Kimball, W. Woodruff, G.A. Smith. End quote. Judging the mission trip from this letter alone, things seemed hunky-dory for the Quorum of the 12 during this mission. They were preaching, baptizing, printing periodicals and church materials, including the hymn book and the Book of Mormon and the Millennial Star, and they even had some time to relax and occasionally take in the sights. But this is just one small snapshot of a nearly 2-year trip of constant proselyting, which was met with, let's just say, mixed results. A few passages later in the history of the church, it includes an article which was printed in England in response to the Mormon mission. So let's read that newspaper extract, and it was printed by Ebenezer Robinson in the Times and Seasons, which was subsequently included in the history of the church. This article says some interesting things, but I'll tell you at the onset, of the newspaper articles that we're going to be reading today, this is one of the mildest that I've seen among a sea of hatred for the Mormons. So this is once again from the Vogel History of the Church, Volume 4, taken from page 234. Quote, "To the editor of the Makes Liberal, Sir, I feel rather surprised and chagrined that the modern delusion, viz. Mormonism, should have made such rapid strides in this town, hitherto considered exempt from the many systems of irreligious creeds which abound in England, America, and elsewhere. I had thought that the powerful and argumentative addresses of the dissenting ministers would have checked such a gross piece of imposition in its infancy, and thus prevented the great mass of our townspeople from becoming dupes of designing knaves, and being led away by every wind of doctrine. Oh, Mr. Editor, I quake for the consequences. Such a wholesale conversion to Mormonism was never before witnessed in any town or country. What will become of our society? What will become of our class meetings? What will become of our brethren in the faith? And above all, what will become of poor Mr. Hayes, that nice and humble man who so nobly stood forward to expose the errors of the Mormon system? God bless him and preserve him from want. But, Mr. Editor, What makes the case worse is that a rumor is prevalent that all these pious men are to be baptized. That is, duly immersed in the salt water of Douglas Bay by that abominable creature Taylor. That's Apostle John Taylor. Surely there must be something enchanting about this vile man. Immersion! My hands shake while I write, and in winter too! Oh, sir, the thought chills my very soul. Surely this American dipper intends to drown them. He can have no other object in my view. Therefore, brethren of the Methodist Society, beware! Drowning is not to be envied, and that too in your sins. In conclusion, brethren, I recommend you to read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest the things which belong to your eternal peace, and listen no longer to the follies of men. Published at Duke Street, Douglas, 29th of October, 1840. End quote. As I said before reading it, this newspaper article was pretty mild in comparison to a few other articles that we'll be getting into soon. It does, however, point to an interesting trend in the mission. The Mormons were obviously making some headway with converts. Hundreds of people had been baptized by late autumn of 1840, and the Europeans were reacting similarly to how Americans were reacting when the Mormons would move into an area and begin baptizing people in droves. There was public outcry. People were pissed that Mormonism was a provable delusion, and many of these Christians considered Joe Smith and the Mormons to be against the will of the true God, or Satanists, or fanatics, which made them and the missionaries out to be pawns of the devil, sent to draw the masses away from God's one true word. So, let's jump into this further. Let me give proper thanks to the internet as, some kind of amorphous, all-knowing entity, because it's incredibly easy to track down newspaper articles of any given time or place, the majority of which are cataloged and indexed for easy searching. So let's read a few that come up with a cursory search of British Newspaper Archive. This is from I think it's it's either Gloucestershire or Gloucestershire. I don't know. The Gloucestershire Chronicle, Saturday, 19th of December, 1840. Quote, "The following facts relative to the Latter-day Saints are chiefly derived from the pamphlets published by Reverends W.J. Morrish and J. Simmons, to which we recently alluded, and which have been largely distributed, particularly in the Ledbury district. We are sorry to learn that the infection has reached the neighborhood of this city in localities distant from any church." Continuing from later in the article, "It has been ascertained that the wife of the very man who wrote what they call the Book of Mormon is now living in Monson, Massachusetts." This is talking about the Spalding theory. "Since the death of her former husband, she had married a second husband named Davidson, and is a woman of irreproachable character and a Christian. Two reverend gentlemen are ready to bear witness that her testimony is worth of full confidence. The book which the Mormonites ever was written by God himself was procured in the following manner, as detailed by Mr. Morrish upon the testimony of Mrs. Davidson." End quote. Then after that, the article goes on to give us a short take on the Spalding theory, how it got legs, and it tells us the whole story from the perspective of the citizens of Ashtabula County. And it even details John Spalding's outburst when he learned that his brother's book had been co-opted by Joseph and Rigdon in order to manufacture a new version of Christianity. Then it reprints some extracts from Mormonism Unveiled by Eber Howe about the character of the Smith family as well as their reputation in New York prior to publishing the Book of Mormon. So this newspaper article was scathing by all standards. But then it finishes with this passage, quote, "In a publication called the Book of Doctrine and Covenants, published by the Mormonites, but which they are careful in not putting into the hands of their professed members generally, it is pretty clearly shewn that filthy lucre is the only object which they seek to obtain. The following passages are addressed to the Mormon preachers or lecturers who are sent out to obtain converts, and these are set as divine revelations and instructions." Now it goes on to quote from the Doctrine and Covenants to make its case. Quoting Doctrine and Covenants, quote, "Whoso feeds you or clothes you or gives you money shall in no wise lose his reward. And he that doeth not these things is not my disciple. By this ye may know my disciples." From later on, "And let all the monies which can be spared, it mattereth not unto me whether it be little or much, be sent up unto the land of Zion, unto those whom I have appointed to receive." Then from later on, Impart a portion of thy property, yea, drink, even part of thy lands, and all save the support of thy family. Pay the debt thou hast contracted with the printer." End quote. Obviously those are three disparate revelations, but if you read through the Doctrine and Covenants, you'll jump right on this bandwagon and agree with the article that says the filthy lucre was definitely one of the objects. It does say that filthy lucre was the only object which they seek to obtain. I don't agree with that, but you will see that underlying theme definitely crop up frequently throughout the Doctrine and Covenants. So the article finishes with saying, "There are many other similar passages in the same book, all tending to a like purport, the supply of money to the preachers. So that, according to the doctrines which they preach, no one refusing them money can belong to their society. This is intelligible enough, and it is matter of considerable surprise that it is boasted in the age of enlightenment and education there could be found individuals who could be cheated with their eyes open by such a system of humbug." End quote. Yes. People were not happy about Christians making money off of, or preachers making money off of their parishioners. And granted, religious leaders have been making money off of their followers for as long as we have religious history, but I can see where it definitely came into conflict with what they were saying. If you're getting paid to proclaim the gospel of Jesus, doesn't that mean that you have a vested interest in selling a certain version of that Jesus, or in making it unique so that people come to you as opposed to the preacher down the street? So I understand the arguments. I don't necessarily agree or wholeheartedly disagree with the arguments. I think that religions do take in way too much money. But that being said, we have historically been giving our resources to people who are thinkers and philosophers and theologians throughout all of human history. And it just so happens that preachers tend to be the most modern iteration of those modern day philosophers and theologians who we give those resources to in order for them to be able to sit down and write stuff. So yeah, it's kind of a mixed bag, and I don't think it's right to say that somebody is preaching something that is true or false based on the fact of how much money they're taking in. So here's another article. This is from the Shrewsbury Chronicle. This is Friday, the 27th of November, 1840. So this is right in the heartland of where we are sitting in the historical timeline when this was published. And the title of the article is The Latter-day Saints. And it even gets it right with a capital L and a hyphen and a lowercase d. So that's encouraging. It goes to say, quote, "We gave in the Shrewsbury Chronicle on the 13th instant a detailed account of a strange sect calling themselves Mormonites, or Latter-day Saints, which are spreading their wild doctrines among ignorant persons in the rural districts of Gloucestershire and Herefordshire. We have had kindly placed into our hands for a few hours, but not sufficiently long, to enable us to attentively peruse them, the celebrated Book of Mormon and a series comprising the numbers of May to October of a monthly periodical published at Manchester called The Latter-day Saints Millennial Star." So the reporters who were publishing this were given a Book of Mormon as well as the publications of the Millennial Star from May to October. They said, we've been able to peruse them, but we haven't had enough time to actually dig deep into these things. But it does, it makes some incredible observations, and it goes on to say, quote, "We have been surprised, not to say shocked, at the evidence which this magazine affords of the sudden growth of these fanatics. For that they must now be a numerous body is certain, from the simple fact that a magazine especially intended for circulation among themselves can find readers enough to make it worthwhile for a publisher to issue it. But besides this inferential mode of calculating the numbers of the body, the magazine affords some statistical tables, from which we see the saints in England must unquestionably amount to thousands, and that no inconsiderable item of their numbers is to be found in their converts in Gloucestershire and Herefordshire." Somebody who lives in England or nearby or knows how to pronounce that, please help me out. I have no idea what that is. Gloucestershire. It's like Worcestershire sauce. All right. Still, from all we can understand of the matter from a cursory perusal of the books which we have seen, we should say that we are confirmed in an opinion we formerly expressed, that no very serious social evil is to be apprehended from this sect, and that provided they escape persecution, the sure method of swelling the ranks of zealots, the imposture will soon be exploded after having probably produced one good result, that of opening the eyes of ministers in the establishment and of the dissenting denominations to the great mass of ignorance and consequent superstitious credulity which exists in this country. So they said, the Mormons have like a few thousand converts here, but the only good that they are going to accomplish is opening the eyes of ministers to showing them how much stupid doctrines and false doctrines can propagate in an area. I think that's profound. That's not true because people converted in Europe. They stayed converted. And in 1953, that was 53. That was when the Bern, Switzerland temple was built or dedicated. And it was the first overseas temple in Europe or anywhere other than the United States. And, well, since then, the Mormons have had a pretty significant foothold in Europe. Significant to themselves. I mean, by population standards, I can't imagine that any more than a couple of small percentage points of any European population actually counts themselves as Mormon today. But that's an ancillary point. Let's continue with the article. From the knowledge I now possess respecting the Latter-day Saints, their printing press at Manchester, their Books of Mormon, of which thousands are circulating, their various clever publications, their interested priesthood, and admirable scheme for raising money, I have not the least doubt but it will require all the exertion of the clergy, of every honest man, and a well-wisher of his country with the influence of the press to eradicate these fanatical opinions. Nothing but kindness and attention to the part of both clergy and laity will succeed. The lower classes must be taught the common principles of Christianity, which at present they do not now, and then, and not till then, will the fatal heresy pass away. Government ought to interfere. Our present plan of education as regards country parishes is worse than a farce. It is downright hypocrisy. Nothing less than cheating both rich and poor, the one out of their money, the other out of their instruction. I trust that I have now given such a brief statement as may induce others to investigate this matter, for many clergymen of my acquaintance were not aware of the poison covertly spreading throughout their parishes." End quote. So, he just reiterates, everybody, we need to know about the Mormons, and we need government interference, we need clergy, we need every honest man and well-wisher of the country, we need the press, we need everybody to unite together to eradicate these fanatical opinions. Interesting. Very well said. Here is another article. This is from the Scotsman, and it was published Wednesday, the 23rd of December, 1840. So a little bit ahead of where we are kind of currently residing in the historical timeline. This one's a little bit shorter. Quote, "Religious imposters, Mormonism." That's the title. "Many of our readers will be aware that a set of imposters calling themselves Mormonites have for several months back been busy in disseminating their tenets in this city and attempting to entice the ignorant and unwary to join their ranks. The sect had its origin some years ago in America, from whence a few adventurers have lately come, in order to circulate their opinions in this country. One of these pretends to be an apostle and declares that he has had intercourse with angels." A lot of people had intercourse with angels in Kirtland. "They also assert that by a particular revelation they became possessed of a book called the Book of Mormon, of equal authority with the Bible." Blasphemy. "And that they have the power of working miracles and of speaking in unknown tongues, etc. The absurdity of these pretensions should have rendered them harmless, but we understand that they have already entrapped a considerable number of individuals. The book called the Book of Mormon was, we understand, written by the late Reverend Solomon Spaulding, a retired clergyman who resided in New Salem, America. It is, in fact, nothing more than a religious romance in the style and phraseology of scriptures." This is the final paragraph. "The adventurers we have now alluded to imagined, no doubt, that their distance from the scene of the original imposture would screen them from detection. But we hope the facts here stated will serve to put individuals on their guard." End quote. Just to let everybody know, the one underlying theme through all of these articles is Solomon Spaulding and Matilda Davidson. The statements that Matilda Davidson made in her various interviews and the claims made in Eberhau's Mormonism Unveiled are just copy and pasted throughout a ton of these articles. So it's not like people were wrestling with the Book of Mormon saying, oh, is it really a historical piece of literature? Is Joseph Smith just a fraud? Is he a dreamer? People weren't talking about Joseph Smith so much as they were talking about Solomon Spaulding and his work being co-opted. It goes to show that whether or not the Spaulding theory is legitimate, is actually true, it got legs. And it was the rumor and the accepted naturalistic explanation for the Book of Mormon for basically everybody. Eberhau's Mormonism Unveiled really contextualized a lot of the understanding of the public about Mormonism. So his work, I've made no bones about this. Eberhau's book was one of the very first Mormon books that I ever read when I first got interested in Mormon history, just because I wanted to say, it was kind of this idea, if I'm going to study Mormonism, I'm going to read the most book I can possibly find in all of Mormon historical literature. So Mormonism Unveiled was it, and on to much more balanced takes on it. But Mormonism Unveiled is invaluable when it comes to the affidavits and the testimonies that are included. So that being said, it had a massive impact. It went through, I think it was either 2 or 3 editions. It was widely published, widely read. And obviously the people on the other side of the Atlantic had picked up a number of copies of this book, and it was commonly circulated. The Spaulding theory was just common knowledge for many people who heard about the Mormons. They heard that Joseph Smith had plagiarized this book from Solomon Spaulding. So, like I said, if you do any perusal of these British newspaper articles, or really any newspaper articles, especially after 1839, that discuss Mormonism, by and large, the vast majority of them do make reference to Solomon Spaulding or Matilda Davidson. But obviously, with the advent of the internet, searching these newspaper databases is much easier now than it was even a decade ago, much less for the entire 170 years of Mormon history research that has been conducted up to 10 years ago. All it takes is a bit of Googling, and you can find newspaper articles from times and places that were never before accessible to historians or scholars, and you can find them in seconds. Well, in perusing through this British newspaper archive, I found an article in a paper called the Hereford Mercury and Reformer, which summarizes a public debate that was conducted between a Mormon missionary who had converted from being a Methodist preacher, who was named George Jones Adams. So just a tiny bit of background on George Adams. He had converted to Mormonism just right before this article was published. He actually founded a small schismatic sect of Mormonism in Palestine after Joe's death, but that was only after he was inducted as an elder in 1840 and he joined the Council of 50. He'd been baptized by Heber C. Kimball about 9 months before this article was published and the confrontation that he had. So what happened? Let me set the scene. George Adams, this Mormon missionary, this Mormon preacher, was on his mission in England, and he landed in this Bedford area, which is where they were publishing this Hereford Mercury and Reformer from. And his challenger was a guy named Mr. Mallows. Mr. Mallows couldn't come up with any convincing arguments against Mormonism. But then, after they had their little confrontation, somebody from the spectating crowd emerged. And I picture it, he slowly comes out with a tweed jacket and a smoking pipe, large thick-brimmed cap, probably big bushy eyebrows and a long beard. He slowly saunters out of this spectating crowd, and he is armed with a wealth of knowledge. Mr. White, that's who we're talking about. Mr. White was the Bedford town skeptic who owned and operated a bookstore. Mr. White had heard of Mormonism, and he had obviously read Eberhau's Mormonism Unveiled. And the way I picture it, he'd probably spent the entire debate just watching anxiously as this Mormon apologist, Mr. Adams, had squirreled out from under every criticism. And I think he was a little fed up with the situation. As everybody was about to disband from this public debate, this public spectacle, Mr. White, Heisenberg, why not Heisenberg, as we'll call him for the purposes of this debate, began with some simple questions for our Mormon apologist, Mr. Adams, or Peter the Apologist, as we'll nickname him for the purposes of this debate. So this sets our scene for the debate, which lasted 3 weeks between our skeptic Heisenberg and Peter the Apologist. Little preface before reading the article. Part of why Mormons became so popular so quickly was because they went viral. Without TV and the myriad pacifiers we spend our free time on today, whatever outside force shook up the community became the hot topic of discussion. And that's what happened when the Quorum of the 12 first appeared on the scene in England and were having prolific success. In the wake of their mission, thousands of people who'd only heard of the Mormons in passing conversation or in reading international newspaper articles suddenly had a neighbor or a friend who was Mormon. The Mormons were a curiosity to the Europeans, at best, but at worst they were also seen as heretical to the pious elite. When the first installment of this debate occurred, it was just a preacher talking to a Mormon preacher in a chapel, and hardly anybody was interested. Once Mr. White, our Heisenberg, stepped up to the stage, people lost their shit. Everybody in the community flocked to the chapel. With standing room only, they were forced to leave the doors open so the masses standing outside of the chapel could hear the proceedings of the debate. So let's get into this. In a day where we can't listen to the debate or hear it or watch it on YouTube, let's just read this newspaper article and see their coverage of it. Once again, this is from the Hereford Mercury and Reformer, beginning with 15th of May, 1841. Quote, "Important discussion on the merits of Mormonism." That's the title. For a considerable time past, the town and neighborhood of Bedford have been convulsed with the preachings, baptizings, and denouncings of the Mormons, or Latter-day Saints. Families have been weaned away from several of the old congregations and lured to join the new sect. An apostle from the Zion of the Church, the United States, by the name of Mr. G.J. Adams, that's our Peter the Apologist, has crossed the Atlantic and visited the heathen of England for the purpose of making converts to the new faith. He has taken up his abode in Bedford and unceasingly proclaims the principles of Mormon. At one of his meetings, several questions were put to him by one of the audience, which ultimately led to a discussion at the castle rooms. That's, I assume, the chapel/church or wherever they were having this debate. The discussion began on Wednesday evening last, and was first maintained principally by the aforesaid Mr. Adams and a plain, sensible man named Mallows. At the end of the meeting, however, Mr. White, that's our Heisenberg, the bookseller, expressed a wish to address a few words to the assembly. He began, this is the opening statement for Mr. Heisenberg here, Mr. White. He began by stating that from what he had heard, he presumed it to be the object of Mr. Adams to introduce the Book of Mormon and the other books of the sect as new revelation from heaven, supplementary to the Bible. He, meaning Heisenberg, therefore wished to lay before the meeting a succinct history of the book called the Book of Mormon. It was pretended, when they use pretended, that means claimed. That's how it was used up until quite recently. It was pretended that it was a translation made from the Egyptian, the original being engraved on gold plates, which were taken from the earth in North America by an angel and given to one Joseph Smith, who, by the help of the long-lost Urim and Thummim, which was given to him at the same time, translated them into the English tongue. Now, all right. So Heisenberg gave us just a brief history, but this is where he brings the slapdown. Now, his very slight knowledge of the Egyptian character told him that at the very least it would take 500 gold plates of the size mentioned, 7 inches by 8 inches, to contain the aforesaid book. And this, it was said, was only part of the original, and these 500 plates would weigh at least 400 weight. That's about right. He, meaning Mr. Heisenberg, would therefore like to know whether Mr. Joseph Smith could carry this alone, or whether the angel helped him. The value of these plates would be at the lowest computation 25,000 pounds, which would fully account for the fact that these plates had never been brought to England. Further, Heisenberg observed that this was an entirely new revelation. He considered that it ought to be authenticated as former heavenly missions were by a display of miraculous powers. That seems rational, right? Heisenberg asking for a miracle to prove the Book of Mormon's authenticity, just like miracles prove the Bible somehow. He's going to get it further into it. When Moses was sent to Pharaoh, God gave him miraculous powers. When the law came from Sinai, there were thunderings and lightnings and an earthquake. When Christ came, the angels appeared to the shepherds, and a miraculous star guided the wise men. And when the apostles preached the word of the Lord, confirmed it by signs following. Now he, meaning Heisenberg, in the name of the meeting, simply asked Mr. Adams, Peter the Apologist, to authenticate his revelation in the same way. And he did this with the more confidence, because Peter had said that no church does not possess the power of working miracles can be the true church, and that the Church of the Latter-day Saints certainly does possess those powers. Then, continued Heisenberg, addressing Peter, there really, sir, can be no difficulty here. Only work us a miracle, and we shall be willing to receive your book. Not an equivocal one, but a plain, manifest, and honest miracle. Booms threw the smackdown on Peter the Apologist here. There is in the town an old gentleman who has not seen the light for many years. Suppose you open his eyes, or if you like it better, go with us to the neighboring graveyard and raise a dead body. And in either case, we pledge ourselves to receive you, as you pretend to be a prophet sent from God. Then I love how the actual article says cheers in parentheses there. Like that's actually in there. People cheering from the crowd. Oh, how dare he? Mr. Adams, that's our Peter the Apologist, made a few remarks after this and concluded by challenging his opponent to meet him on the following evening. End quote. All right, so it ended up being that Peter the Apologist declined performing the miracle. And, Heisenberg offered a few possibilities, like, hey, there's an old blind man. If you are indeed a prophet or you are indeed a missionary claiming to have the one true religion and God's power on your side and the power of healing and all of this, just go perform a miracle for us and we'll happily receive your book. And the people cheered for it. I mean, this is a pretty good instance where God could have performed a miracle to prove to these people that Mormonism is the one true church, but Peter the Apologist declined performing the miracle. And I have to ask, doesn't that mean that he didn't truly believe what he was saying at some level? If Peter, Mr. Adams, actually thought that he had the one true church, wouldn't he go forward and say, okay, I will do this miracle and leave it up to the Lord to actually perform the miracle through his hands? But since he declined doing the miracle, doesn't that mean at some level that he actually doesn't believe that it can come true? He doesn't believe that a miracle can happen? I mean, there's no way to test this. There's no way to know what was really going on in Peter the Apologist's brain. But, I mean, God had his back if he were, putting forward the one true church. But he didn't trust in God for this. I don't know, just an interesting aside. The article continues, on the following evening, these two gentlemen met again, and it was deemed a requisite for the sake of order that a chairman should be elected. Mr. J. Wyatt was called to sustain that office, who laid down the rules of the discussion, that each speaker should be allowed half an hour and that both speakers were to be heard without interruption. Okay, so finally they were like, all right, we need a formal debate with these guys. And they met the following evening, and Mr. J. Wyatt it took the position of moderator of the discussion, which is good. It's almost an Oxford-style debate. Each person gets 30 minutes to make their case, and we got crossfire and examination, and then so on and so forth. I'm glad that they're setting this up. It almost seems like they're trying to get to the intellectual nature of this. Mr. Adams, Peter the Apologist, opened the discussion by stating that his opponent was mistaken in what he had said about the Egyptian language. Oh, gasp. For the peculiar character of that language was that a great deal could be got into a little space. Not exactly a testable claim, is it, even today? So he was saying that in response to, Heisenberg saying, well, if the Book of Mormon did come from these plates, then you would need at least 500 gold plates with the Egyptian writing on them in order for it to, contain all of the writings that's in the Book of Mormon. And apologists will say today, oh, that's not a problem because Egyptian is a phonetic language or whatever the case is, and it's much more space conscious than English is. English wastes a lot of space. But the problem is, like, the supposed language that the Book of Mormon or the Gold Bible, the golden plates were written in was Reformed Egyptian. That's not a real language. It's not a testable claim. We can't look at it in whatever this Reformed Egyptian is today and compare it for, space conscientiousness the way, to English or whatever other language, the way that we can with, let's say, like ancient Hebrew or Greek or something to that effect. So, yeah, I mean, Peter just saying, oh, yeah, well, we don't know, because obviously the Egyptian language is a great deal could be got into a little space. I mean, that's just a baffling or a baffling apologetic here. But he goes on to continue making his case. But supposing that there might be the weight that Heisenberg talked of. Okay, so now he's saying when Heisenberg said that the plates, if they were 500 pages of plates, then they would have weighed 400 pounds. This is Peter the Apologist's response. Did not Samson carry the gates of Gaza? Did he not catch 300 foxes? And did he not slay 1,000 men with the jawbone of an ass? What about all the other people that hefted the plates? Were they super empowered as well? I mean, that's my only question to that is, it wasn't just Joseph who ran through the woods with these plates. A bunch of men hefted them and said they were between 40 and 70 pounds. So, yeah, that doesn't really hold up either. But of course, Peter continues. But according to his opponent, the power of God was limited now. He referred to the Bible, and by that he would abide. Peter then quoted the 49th chapter of Genesis, 22nd and 24th verse, and this is the quote, Joseph is a fruitful bough, etc., but his bough abode in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong by the God of Jacob. From thence is the shepherd the stone of Israel. And this text he considered in connection with the 26th verse, where it said, the blessing of the Father have prevailed unto the utmost bounds of the everlasting hills. Clearly proved in his mind that the descendants of Joseph were to introduce a new dispensation, for the shepherd of Israel could not mean Christ, as he did not come from Joseph, but from Judah. And if from Egypt, where Jacob was when he pronounced this blessing, you were to calculate what was the utmost bound, you would find that it was the far west of America where this book was found, which book actually revealed that the North American Indians were the descendants of Joseph. I'll deal with this whole apologetic in a second. It goes on to say, he then quoted the 29th chapter of Isaiah, 11th and the following verses, where a book was mentioned which neither the learned nor the unlearned could read, and this he considered clearly proved that a book was foretold. And as neither the learned nor the unlearned could read the Book of Mormon when it was found, he had no doubt that was the book intended. He further referred to the passage of Ezekiel where the prophet was commanded to take 2 sticks, one for Judah and one for Joseph. Sticks were ancient record, and by reasoning which we confess not clearly to have understood, he affirmed that these sticks pointed to a new revelation which he had no doubt was now made by the Book of Mormon. End quote. Okay. This is a common apologetic today. It's what apologists do all the time. Well, the Bible foretells of the Book of Mormon, and they hearken to this Ezekiel where it says the stick of Judah and the stick of Joseph. They say the stick of Judah is the Bible, stick of Joseph is the Book of Mormon. That's a completely inaccurate post hoc interpretation of that Bible passage. And then he quotes the 29th chapter of Isaiah, which mentioned that a book would come forth which neither the learned or the unlearned could read. Well, the learned and unlearned could not read the Book of Mormon just because they couldn't look at it. If they were to have examined these plates, whatever they were, wherever they were, anything, if any learned person like Charles Anthon would have looked at the plates, he would have been able to say, wow, this is legitimate. Or he'd be able to say, yeah, you just made these up in your workshop, didn't you? I mean, obviously they're made out of copper or tin, and tin isn't exactly an old American metal. So the whole apologetic is that the Book of Mormon is prophesied of in the Bible. And this is what is frequently used and trotted out, that the Bible had some kind of predictive power of the Book of Mormon. But when you write a book and you extract little tiny cherry-picked passages out of the Bible that supposedly prove your book, you can make anything prophetic in the Bible, or anything that sounds prophetic in the Bible, prophesy of anything that you want. That's the beauty of the Bible, is there's 1,600 pages or whatever that you can cherry pick anything you want out of it. And just post hoc rationalizing these prophecies doesn't hold any power whatsoever. This is a completely useless metric by which to judge truth or truthiness. And let's even get back to the foundation of this. What the hell did that whole screed about the prophecy in the Bible of the Book of Mormon have to do with how heavy the fucking gold plates were, right? I mean, or anything that Heisenberg was bringing up in opposition in this debate. What did this prophecy have to do with anything? I mean, I'm astonished to see this like brain dead monkey shit illogic apologetics being birthed so early in Mormon history. I mean, these are criticisms that I would bring up against apologists today. Doesn't that say something about the significant problems in church history if they're still running from the same criticisms 175 years after these things were raised? I don't know. It's sad. It's really pathetic. Let's continue on with the debate. Heisenberg, slowly putting the fractured pieces of his own brain back together after such an impudent and ignorant screed, that's my own addition, in reply, shortly explained the text referred to. The first, he said, did not foretell that the shepherd of Israel should come from Joseph, as his opponent had alleged, but from the God of Jacob. And in the text quoted from Isaiah, the prophet did not say that there should be a book, but that the words of the prophet foretelling the judgments coming upon Jerusalem were so awful, astonishing, and incomprehensible as to be like a sealed book. It was merely a simile. And as to the sticks of Ezekiel, it was nothing more than a forcible way common among the prophets of old of expressing their meaning, which in this case he took to be that, though the tribe of Judah and the other tribes were separated, they should come together again. So he's saying that the sticks are just these different tribes, these Jewish tribes that were going to come back together. And it was actually just a simile. But supposing that the interpretations given by Peter the Apologist were correct, what had they to do with the Book of Mormon? Okay, so that was actually awesome. So what Heisenberg did was say, okay, so I'm going to answer these stupid little things that you brought up about the Book of Mormon being foretold of in the Bible. Basically, they had nothing to do with the Book of Mormon, and Joseph Smith had nothing to do with Joseph of Egypt or the God of Jacob or whatever all of these apologetics are. Joseph probably wasn't even Jewish. So he brought it all back, though. What had they to do with the Book of Mormon? So I absolutely love that. He chased off the red herring and jumped right back into the relevant question. I love Heisenberg here. It continues, supposing that the prophet Isaiah and Ezekiel did mean that a book should be found, what proof had they that the Book of Mormon was the book? There you go. What is, if indeed the Bible prophecies that Peter were claiming foretold of the Book of Mormon, how are we to know that the Book of Mormon is actually the book that they foretell of? Why isn't it like the Voynich manuscript, or why wouldn't it be the Book of Madoc, something to that effect? I mean, who knows? Why is it the Book of Mormon? And it goes on. He again demanded that it should be authenticated by a miracle. Boom! Peter cannot get away from Heisenberg. He's give us a miracle and we'll believe in your book, man. And Heisenberg continues to lay out his case. He then proceeded to lay open some of the absurdities of this book. It professed to be a narrative of the flight of some Jews from Jerusalem in the reign of Zedekiah. And the first proof of its forgery he would adduce would be found in page 53, where it mentioned a mariner's compass having been used about 1900 years before the discovery of that instrument. Heisenberg's great. He's hitting on the anachronisms. Perhaps his opponent would get out of this difficulty by alleging that God could teach the use of the compass, though it had not been discovered by men. A convenient but he, meaning Peter, apprehended not a very satisfactory mode. He further noticed that the book could not have been written when it professed to have been, as in it there were numerous instances of Greek words being used. Yeah, that's a big problem. Greek words in the Book of Mormon before Greek was even a language, such as Christ, Jesus, Alpha, Omega, by a people who at that time could not have known anything about Greek. Heisenberg's amazing. Oh, man. But one of the strongest arguments that the book was a gross imposture was the following fact. It was said that this book was translated by Joseph Smith from the Egyptian character, but on referring to its pages, he found that all the quotations from scripture with which the book abounded were exactly in the words of our authorized version, with an exclamation point. So now he's hitting on Bible plagiarisms in the Book of Mormon. Now, a coincidence of this kind was utterly impossible. I mean, Heisenberg did his fucking homework. Look, he hit on the Greek and the Bible errors that are included in the Book of Mormon before Greek was a language, and the Bible errors that are from the King James translation, which didn't come about until, almost 2,000 years after the book was written. I mean, and anachronisms. He's talking about a compass 1900 years before a compass was even discovered. And of course, Peter the Apologist was like, well, if God could have given them a compass, he could have taught them how to use it too. I mean, Heisenberg's just nailing this guy to the floor. I love it. By this, it would be seen that the words were written in every case different, although the sense was the same. And if 500 people were each to undertake the same task, the language of no two of the 500 would be the same. He therefore would ask his opponent how Joseph Smith happened to hit exactly upon the very words of our translators. That's actually a really intelligent argument. When the translators of the Greek manuscript were compiling the Bible into the King James Version or into whatever version are being used, each of them translate things slightly differently because obviously Greek to English and Hebrew to English is not a perfect translation. They're not like they're both Latin based that have similar roots and similar kind of phonetics. They're very different languages. But Heisenberg says, how is it that there are errors from the translators that translated the Bible that we currently have? How did they translate it incorrectly the same way into the Book of Mormon? That just couldn't be the case. I mean, that's a really solid counter-apologetic. That's a solid damning case against the Book of Mormon. Heisenberg continues, he therefore would ask his opponent how Joseph Smith happened to it exactly upon the very words of our translators. But further, it was alleged that he, meaning Joseph Smith, translated by inspiration, and it might therefore be said that he was inspired to use the same words as our translators used. But our translation was imperfect in many parts. It was acknowledged by all to be wrong, and yet Mr. Smith, inspired as he was, adopted all our blunders. Oh, it's so true. How is it that if, Joseph Smith was translating the Book of Mormon with the gift from God through the stone, it was telling him how to write everything, that inaccuracies that find their way into the Bible are also in the Book of Mormon. I mean, that's solid. Perhaps Peter the Apologist could satisfactorily explain this. Otherwise, he must be contented to have his book scouted as an imposture. At all events, he, Peter, could not be surprised if a miracle was again demanded to authenticate a book with so much suspicion about it. Yeah, of course. He's like, yeah, those are no problems. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if you asked for a miracle again, because that's what Heisenberg was doing the whole time. This is a beautiful debate. Peter the Apologist, in reply, did little but reiterate the arguments that he before adduced from the three texts of Scripture above quoted, affirming that Heisenberg had not, as he had wished, gone to the Bible, but had talked very learnedly about Greek languages. But that was the way with this generation. You damn kids are learning too much in your Greek book words and whatnot. He, however, was for bringing everything to the Bible. Heisenberg again answered the scriptures quoted and then proceeded to say that in a book which professed to give a history of the Book of Mormon, he found it stated that a copy of part of the writing of the plates had been submitted to Professor Anthon of New York. So this book that he's talking about, in a book which professed to give the history of the Book of Mormon, that I can only assume that was Eberhau's Mormonism Unveiled. And there are a number of other passages throughout this that make me think that, Heisenberg had done his homework and he read through Eberhau's book. The Professor Anthon transcript. So yeah, he's talking about Anthon and Martin Harris taking the transcript to him. That would be not so smarty Marty, super study smarty party pooper pal Charles Anthon. There you go. All right, I remembered it. Okay, so this gentleman, he was very well known by reputation, and if it had been stated that the learned professor had seen the plates, the matter would have assumed a different complexion. Okay. But as it stood, this name went for nothing. Okay. This is brilliant. Let me continue reading here because this is something that Heisenberg hits on that is beautiful. It's even a current problem with the Book of Mormon. He says, at the end of the book, there were 2 testimonials signed by a number of individuals, that's the 3 and the 8 witnesses, who stated that they had seen the plates, but these names had no places of abode or occupation affixed, and therefore could not be of any weight. Bam! Heisenberg went after the credibility of the 3 and the 8 witnesses. Okay, that's valid. He said, okay, Charles Anthon is a learned Columbia professor. If he would have seen the plates, we would be having a different conversation right now. But the people who saw the plates were these random nothing people we've never heard of. They're not professors. They're not learned men. They are not archaeologists. They're not anybody who we would expect they're not Bible scholars that we would expect to see, legitimacy ascribed to the Book of Mormon. It was just a bunch of people with the last name of Smith and Whitmer and Cowdery and Harris and Page. None of those people hold any credibility. I mean, this Mr. White is classic Heisenberg here. He continues saying, such names would not get a check for £5 cashed at the bank. I love that. And would anyone trust his immortal soul to such an unsatisfactory testimony? Oh, that's so amazing. Yes, actually, it turns out that millions of people would trust the 11 witnesses and agree with what they said and not question their testimony. To bring it all down. Yeah. It turns out that just because those people signed their names on this document, people think that it's authentic because there are names signed on a document. It doesn't mean it doesn't matter that the document was drafted up and brought to these people and almost forcibly signed by Joseph Smith. It doesn't, the names of the people none of that seems to matter. And the fact that none of them are actually educated individuals who would have had a legitimate horse in this race, who would have been able to throw, a name and some of their reputation at this thing. I mean, just that simple fact doesn't seem to matter to so many Mormons today. So, people would trust their immortal soul to such an unsatisfactory testimony. In conclusion, he had a word or two to say to his opponent. It was in his, meaning Peter's, opinion, no trifling matter to be a leader of the people. Were he the editor of a newspaper, he should never put his pen to a paper without remembering the responsibility of being even a political leader of men's opinions. But how much graver a matter it must be to be a leader in concerns which affected men's eternal interests. Okay, let me finish reading this and I'll try and sum it up. But how much graver a mistake, blah, blah, blah. And he had never talked to a truly conscientious minister on the subject without finding that his responsibility was felt at times almost too great to be borne. So this is actually a pretty interesting point. It seems that Heisenberg is making the argument that what Joe and the missionary are doing is actually immoral because what they're doing is tampering with people's salvation when they are, asking them to believe in the Book of Mormon. And for somebody like Joe, who knew that the Book of Mormon was a fabrication, that's just profoundly immoral, and that they should be essentially ashamed that they don't hold people's mortality and eternal salvation in higher regard. That's a really good point. I like that. But his opponent, Peter, had not only started as a leader, but had attempted to lead men entirely away from the old and beaten paths to heaven. He, meaning Heisenberg, would seriously warn him, meaning Peter, that this could not be a light and trifling matter. If his followers fell into a snare with their eyes open, doubtless they would perish. But if so, what, in the great day of account, would be the doom of the man who, not satisfied with his own ruin, had labored hard to allure his fellow creatures to destruction? The meeting then separated, end quote. I really like what Heisenberg did with this. So Peter and Heisenberg, that's, Mr. Adams and Mr. White, They weren't done with this. They weren't finished with taking intellectual swings at each other, because they did meet again. And the second debate was actually published in the next week's edition of the Hereford Mercury and Reformer, where this first article came from. They went back and rehashed all of the same points that they hit on in the first debate, with Heisenberg never relenting on those same damning arguments, while Peter continued to grandstand and red herring and evade any actual answers. However, Heisenberg did hit Peter on the Mormons condoning slavery, which he didn't hit on in this first debate, which England actually had the historic high ground over America in that regard, because they had outlawed slavery a few decades prior to this argument. So Peter answered by saying the condoning of slavery was issued to keep the Mormons from being persecuted in Missouri, which obviously didn't work. The crowd didn't like it, and this is how their second debate concluded. Quote, Heisenberg, in reply, said that when Joseph Smith and his accomplices repented, as the persons alluded to had done, there would be no objections to their again being received into the church, and they might even become its teachers if they possessed of the necessary abilities. Well, so Heisenberg's like, hey, if you decide that you're following bullshit right now, you should try and convert back into, mainstream Christianity. You can even become one of the teachers of it. I love that. The article continues. The chairman then announced that the discussion on the subject of the Book of Mormon was closed, and he should take the sense of the meeting as to whether Mr. Adams, Peter, had, by scripture and reason, proved that the Book of Mormon was authentic, or whether it was a vile imposture. Kind of poisoning the well there a little bit, but still a relevant question. He called for a show of hands. So they wanted the crowd's feedback on how the debate went. When there appeared in favor of the Mormonites about half a dozen, about 6 people, and against them more than 500. So the chairman, Mr. Wyatt, was like, all right, how do these guys do? All those in favor of Mormonism? And 5-6 people raised their hand, and all of those opposed, and everybody raised their hands and cheered and clapped. Ah! Oh, this is beautiful. This is like almost a stylized Oxford debate throwdown style. This is great. Like celebrity death match of Oxford duking it out. Order having been obtained, the chairman stated that the Latter-day Saints had collected pence at the door of all who attended the meeting, upon the understanding that it was merely to defray the expenses attendant on the discussion. So there were missionaries actually at the door who were panhandling, basically, if you want to come watch the debate, give us a little money. So the chairman was brilliant in what he did next. The meeting was anxious to know what had been collected. He had therefore called in the money takers and found that after paying the whole expense, there remained a balance of £3.02. As this was public money, he should take the sense of the meeting as to the disposal of it. So it's like, all right, so these, Mormons aren't going to fuck off with your guys' money after, this debate, after so solidly being crushed in this debate. So what do you guys want to have done with it? And then this is great. It was then proposed that Heisenberg, and seconded in several parts of the room, that Mr. Wyatt, the chairman, should hold the money until Christmas Day and then see that it was given to the inmates of the Union Workhouse in roast beef and plum pudding. Oh, it's brilliant. End quote. That's it. But actually that wasn't it. So this was the second of their third confrontation. Obviously Peter the Apologist had been just eviscerated in this debate. Heisenberg knew his shit. He'd done his homework and absolutely massacred Peter's face in all of this. And they had a final exchange. Peter came back, bloodied, bruised, and beaten. He came back for another final knockout punch. But this final exchange, so what happened during the second debate? Heisenberg brought up a few criticisms of the Doctrine and Covenants. So the problem with so many of the converts in Europe is they didn't have access to the Doctrine and Covenants because the missionaries didn't print it when they were here. They were busy printing hymnals, Books of Mormon, and the Millennial Star. So they didn't print a Liverpool edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. And the people in Europe, whether this is true or not, they thought that it's because the Mormons were hiding and priestcrafting this extra bit of doctrine. Like they would, give you the milk, they'd hand you the Book of Mormon and say, read this and pray about it. But their real teachings that were enshrined in the Doctrine and Covenants, they were holding those back. And that was the meat, right? So the people were kind of infuriated a bit because it seemed like the clandestine operations, in addition to the rumors of polygamy and militia activities that were, being conducted by the Mormons, they thought that the Mormon missionaries were priestcrafting because they were keeping this extra doctrine behind a paywall. You have to join in order to get a copy of the Doctrine and Covenants. So what happened is the apostle Orson Hyde, we know him as Orson L'Chaim, because of his mission out to the Holy Land, to Palestine. He set up a couple of branches out in Israel, and he spent a number of years out there. He was on his way to his mission, and he had with him a copy of the Doctrine and Covenants. So Peter the Apologist went and talked to Orson L'Chaim and said, hey, can you help me out? This guy Heisenberg is crushing me. And he's making accusations that in the Doctrine and Covenants, it condones slavery. So Orson Hyde came to this third debate with his copy of the Doctrine and Covenants. And then Mr. White, Heisenberg, took this as an opportunity to show how much Mormonism was actually just a multi-level marketing scheme. And it's beautiful. So this follows in the 29th of May, 1841 publication of this same Hereford Mercury and Reformer. So let's read how the third confrontation went between these gentlemen. All right. Mr. Wyatt, that's the chairman, then repeated the charge of upholding slavery and commented on the apostles' explanation of the passage in the book when he said they did not preach the gospel to the slaves without the consent of their masters because it would subject them to the persecution of the masters. Okay, so that's actually true. The Mormons, when they first started proselyting out in Missouri, they were passing out flyers and telling people that, hey, we will, the various, they call them mulattoes, but the freed slaves and the interracial people out there who are illiterate, if you come to the Mormon church, we'll teach you how to read by giving you a copy of the Book of Mormon. You got to pay us for it, but we'll teach you how to read. And that was seen as very inflammatory to the Missouri slaveholders, which were also the Missouri powermen, the noblemen who held all of the political power and, ran in the upper circles were slaveholders, of course. So that was actually one of the main issues between the Missourians and the Mormons was slavery. So that assertion is actually true, but it still does essentially condone slavery. This is actually in D&C 134, I think it says. But okay, so let's just read what the article says. So impudent an avowal, said Mr. Wyatt, as this speaks louder than the host of arguments which might be brought against this awful creed, and could produce but one impression upon the meeting, namely, that it was what he before denounced to be a wicked imposture to raise money for the support of the fellows Joseph Smith, Martin Harris, Sidney Rigdon, and the remainder of the apostles of the Mormonite settlement. So he's like, yeah, the slavery part is horrible. The whole Book of Mormon and Doctrine and Covenants, it's all just a fucking scam to support Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, and Martin Harris. They didn't realize Martin Harris was estranged from the broader Mormon community in Nauvoo at this time, but they had read Martin Harris was an important figure through E. Howe's book, and they realized that he was obviously had some advantageous gains from the Book of Mormon. And also, I should mention this, Heisenberg did quote from Howe's book, the affidavit where somebody was talking to Martin Harris, and Martin Harris said, "Oh, if you'll leave me alone, I can make money of it." So that really swayed the crowd in making them believe that this was just a multi-level marketing scheme. So it continues. They do not believe it right to interfere with bond servants and slaves to preach the gospel to them. Why? Because they know that it would prevent the present compact between them, the Mormons, and the selfish slave owners for keeping their fellow creatures in abject slavery and filling their coffers of their treasury. That's a relevant point. So if you are putting out revelations that are condoning slavery, basically, or not condemning it, that's all you had to do. The Heisenberg was saying that is because you were filling your coffers with the money from the slave owners and you didn't want to piss them off. That's actually relevant. It went further. The Mormons didn't want to be exterminated. So they, chased from Missouri, but it still didn't work because they were inevitably chased from Missouri. But the point still stands. If you're pandering to evil people, you're going to end up doing evil shit. Wow. Okay. The person who had just delivered the lecture refused to let him have the book. There you go. Orson LaHaiden was like, yeah, it doesn't say anything about slavery in here. You can't have it, though. You can't read this book. It's my only copy. Or he would have read to you a passage or two which would still have more convinced you that the object of these wicked men is fraud. Their soul is gain, and they care nothing for your spiritual or temporal welfare, so long as they can persuade you to fill their pockets. That is so true. Orson Hyde said, you can't have my copy of the Doctrine and Covenants because you're just going to read through it and pull out and cherry pick passages that talk about giving Joseph Smith money. That's because there are dozens and dozens of those passages throughout the Doctrine and Covenants. I mean, it seems like almost every other revelation in there is something about giving Joseph money, or the rich giving their money to the poor, or something about the United Order, or like tithing, whatever the case is. So many of the revelations deal with money. So when you read that from an outsider's perspective, you're like, oh, wow, Joseph must be fucking loaded. It's just amazing. Okay. So Peter the Apostle goes on to reply. Mr. Adams replied and said he was willing to shew the book to any person who would call on him. The article says hisses. So he's like, I'll show you the book. Boo! Hiss. And he should, for the future, give a lecture nightly at Mr. Mail's room. Mr. Mail was a member of the community, obviously a believing Mormon. He solemnly declared that he devoutly believed in the principles of Mormon and that he was willing to be a martyr in that cause. Well, so after all of this, after everyone in the crowd in the second debate had been like, no, fuck these Mormon guys, he is still like, I know this is true. I know Joseph Smith's a prophet. I know we're led by a modern prophet in these latter days. I love my mom and dad. I mean, he was still just bearing his testimony, and he's happy to be a martyr in the cause. And the next part is fucking beautiful. Since he had been here, meaning in Bedford, threats had been extended to him, and one person had expressed his readiness to shoot him. So, in parentheses, loud cries of name. So he said, I'm willing to be a martyr for this cause. Since I've been here, people have threatened to shoot me. And then the crowd's like, give us a name. Who threatened to kill you? Who? And then his reply is great. He did not know the name, but had been told as much. Hisses, boo. The crowd's like, fuck you. You accuse us of trying to kill you or of, threatening you. And then you don't remember the name of the person who threatened you. Really? That's what you're going to go with? Oh, wow. If he had any credibility with a single person in the crowd on this third and final meeting, all of it was gone. That credibility was shot to hell. There's nothing left in this guy's ammunition bag. And this is the last couple passages. Mr. Wyatt, that's the chairman, then said he regretted that such a charge had been preferred against the people of Bedford upon a hearsay. Right? He was like, yeah, this guy just accused you of death threats. That's just hearsay. That is, how dare you accuse us of that? That is, I like Mr. Wyatt. He's a good moderator, and added that such was his good opinion of the people that he would hold himself responsible for any harm done to the apostles of Mormon so long as they acted with decorum. Cheers. Yay. Awesome. Yay. Mr. Wyatt's awesome. So, I mean, that's awesome. He's obviously honest about this. He's being an intellectually honest person. He says, how dare you charge us of that? And if anybody hurts you, I will be responsible for their conduct. Wow. Okay. Final passages. Mr. Wyatt, the chairman, concluded by begging the audience not to pin their faith upon the doctrines of Mormon, and quoted the second epistle of Peter, second chapter, where false prophets are foretold, who through covetousness should with feigned words make merchandise of the people. Which the people responded, hear, hear, yeah, fuck that guy. Mr. Adams, that's Peter the Apologist, then dissolved the meeting, and we are strongly of the opinion that this is the last demonstration that will be made by the Mormons. End quote. I love this so much. And it must have been. That was the last one, because I didn't see another article from that paper covering the Mormons for another 3 months after this. So, Peter the Apologist must have just slinked away with his tail tucked firmly betwixt his nuts and never returned to Bedford. It's good. When you are met with logical questions and you have no answer, and then you accuse people of threatening you with death threats, and you lose the entire crowd to the utmost, just utter pathetic level that Peter the Apologist had lost, there was no coming back. No, I doubt that a single person in that congregation walked away saying, oh, I'm going to get baptized now, because Peter looked like an asshole, right? And Heisenberg looked like the cool, rational, calculated, researched guy. He owns a bookstore. He's probably well learned. And in one of the articles, it said that he was well schooled in Greek and Chaldaic and Hebrew. So he was obviously a Bible scholar at some level, and he'd probably attended university. And, this Mormon apologist who had previously been a Methodist minister converted, thought that he had the one truth. He went up in this intellectual Oxford style debate in Bedford and was squashed. That's it. And I guess that's the point. All it takes is just a learned man or woman, a learned person debating a Mormon missionary to, well, in this case, cause a spectacle and then send the Mormon on their way with no answers, with the crowd's laughter and hisses ringing in their ears. And one thing I can't really help but notice is that the same problems that scholars and historians have with the Book of Mormon today are the same exact arguments critical thinkers were bringing up a decade after the Book of Mormon was published. And just like the 19th century Mormons had no answer for these myriad criticisms, Mormons today can't answer those questions any better. Even with the massive depth of knowledge and new scholarship and research that's being conducted daily on their behalf, sitting in their toolbox. On one hand, it's kind of sad to think that the arguments haven't changed for nearly 2 centuries, and they likely won't change for another 2 centuries, because these are foundational issues with the hard truth claims that the church makes. But on the other hand, though, according to this reporter, the crowd was resoundingly in favor of the skeptic's arguments, and the Mormon Apologist was laughed out of the room, with only half a dozen out of the 500 plus in attendance still espousing belief in the religion. And let's face it, they had probably gone to the debate already believing in the Book of Mormon. If we have a margin error of, 1% in public debates with Mormon apologists, I think that doesn't speak well to the viability of the church's teachings. And it just goes to show that regardless of the time, the place, or the specific skeptic who's asking the questions, the Book of Mormon, and by extension the Mormon religion, will never stand up to the harsh and critical, white-hot light of public scrutiny. We owe it to the Mormons to get in these arguments. We owe it to the spectators to see the arguments hashed out. And I'm glad, man. I'm really happy that Heisenberg came along. Somebody who knew Mormon history, who had read Eber D. Howe's book and had armed themselves with the critical arguments necessary to shatter the Mormon belief system. And he presented them in a well-calculated and thought-out manner, and the crowd was swayed. Sometimes these arguments are just worth having. With Utah being one of the most notoriously red states, and, of course, capitalism being one of the few underlying platforms on which the GOP runs, it's important to take a step back and see what God has to say about what this perfect society would be. When we examine the teachings in the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants, some interesting trends begin to emerge, one of which is the communal or the socialistic aspect of it. It just so happens that we're joined today by Mike, who made an amazing post on the ExMormon subreddit, and he's going to educate us on some hard statistics in comparison to model cities put forth in the Book of Mormon. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So this Reddit post that I'm referring to is titled Utah versus Norway, an armchair experiment. And then you summarize it by saying Norway is closer to being Zion in every characteristic described by the scriptures. And I'm stoked to talk to you about this because you did a systematic deconstruction using hard statistics, well-sourced statistics of the comparisons of what we would expect to see here. So if you don't mind, I'd like to talk to you about that. But before doing so, do you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and how you came to write this and how we came to talking together today?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm from Utah, born and raised in that area. And do
you mind telling me what part, just out of my own curiosity?
Yeah, northern Utah, up near Ogden.
Okay, yeah, I went to school in Ogden, so yeah.
Okay, we've got a lot in common.
I was just
there.
Curious, that's all.
Yeah, well, then,
that's right.
then I won't need to tell you too much about kind of the political situation there, but maybe that's an important point to kind of get into. So, I mean, being raised in Utah, you're surrounded by a very conservative political approach. And although it's, not officially linked with the church, it semi-officially is. I mean, it feels very much like it's a requirement as a member of the church that you vote Republican and that you believe Democrats are the source of all evil. If, there's one group worse than them, it's the socialists or the communists, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. I'd love to compare that with the doctrines of it, but we'll get into that discussion. But so you are not actually recording from Utah, though. So you were born and raised there. Walk us through a little bit more of your walk.
Yeah, sure. So I'd served an LDS mission in Chile. And this was an interesting time to be a missionary. So I was a missionary there from 2000 to 2002, meaning that I was there when 9/11 happened. And 9/11 is also a day of infamy in Chile. For those that don't know, this is the day that Pinochet came into power in the 70s. And overthrew the government. It was, thousands of people were killed, and it established a dictatorship that went on for a good 20 years, which shaped what Chile is today. And so
a lot of world-shaping things seem to happen in September, don't they?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, the Chileans, they still celebrate, I guess, in quotes, the September 11th. I mean, those that oppose Pinochet and oppose what happened there, they, on the 11th of September, they're burning tires in the street. They cut electricity to parts of the city, that kind of thing. So when I was there, September 11th, 2001, they were, the immediate reaction from many Chileans was, we did this. To the U.S.
Whoa.
That this was
Okay.
finally the Chileans getting some payback to the Americans that had supported Pinochet.
I'm sure that there are some YouTube conspiracy theorists who would agree with you, but
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously it's very clear that isn't the case, but that's just to let you know, as a young missionary, kind of shocking to me to start to then have more of an interest in, well, what was this? What did Pinochet do? Why did the U.S. support him? And I was, coming from Utah, quite naive, not really with a global education or understanding geopolitics at all. I spent the first year of my mission before 9/11 assuming Pinochet was a communist, because Pinochet is evil and evil people are communists. It turns out it's the exact opposite. So Chile had a democratically elected socialist president, Salvador Allende, and he, this is during the time of the Cold War. The South America is a battleground for the Cold War. The U.S. was very nervous about all of the leftist countries in South America, and with Allende coming into power on what seemed like a communist platform, they were very interested in overthrowing him. And Pinochet, as the head of the military at the time, was happy to do so, and he was, trying to restore Chile to a more open market capitalist society. And so that's actually what was going on in Chile. So I didn't know this at the time of 2001, but that's my starting point for getting interested and trying to understand, well, what is going on with all of these economic structures? Why are the Chileans still so angry about something that happened in the early 70s? And that ultimately led me to study political science at university after my mission.
Interesting. Okay. Is that what you have your degree in?
Yeah. So I did a year of university at BYU before my mission, but when I returned back, I went to school at Weber State and did a bachelor's there in political science, a minor in history, and then went on to a PhD program at the University of Texas in Austin. And my emphasis, every good political scientist, of course, has to read a lot of the economic theories and models behind things along with more of the political theory. But, Marxism, reading about, Adam Smith, Capital, all of these things are a basic part of the training. And so it was during kind of those years that I really questioned and changed my stance on what economic models we should be pursuing. And the funny thing about that is, basically that was because of my Mormon beliefs.
No kidding.
Yeah, it seemed very clear to me what economic model God wanted. It's all over in the New Testament, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, the early history of the church. It was a much more communal and socialistic economic model that is written about and proposed and endorsed by the scriptures. And so it was, that time period in my life for the next 10 years as a practicing Mormon, trying to reconcile why it is that, the current leadership of the church is so capitalist, and why it is that, Utah, being the home of Mormonism, is such a conservative, pro-capitalism, welfare, anti-social state. Because this just didn't seem to align with the scriptures as I've seen them.
Well, I guess it's a matter of cherry picking out of the scriptures, because Mormons are also, heavy into the prosperity doctrine. If you are righteous, then the Lord will bless you with many possessions and wonderful pickup trucks and whatnot. And then up to a certain point, right? That's the teaching replete throughout the Book of Mormon is the people, usually the Nephites, began to become really wealthy in all of their righteousness, and they became too wealthy, and then they turned wicked, and it was just, a flip-flop, constant battle between having too many good things and not having enough, and being scolded by the Lamanites outright God. But I do find it fascinating, the social structures that are discussed throughout the Book of Mormon. And you actually made an allusion to one of those in this Reddit post of this city that's described in 4th Nephi 1. And let me just read the scripture here. And it came to pass in the 36th year, the people were all converted unto the Lord upon all the face of the land, both Nephites and Lamanites, and there were no contentions and disputations among them, and every man did deal justly one with another, and they had all things common among them. Therefore there were not rich and poor, bond and free, but they were all free. They were all made free and partakers of the heavenly gift. So it describes, and the next verse is short, and it came to pass, give that a drink, that the 37th year passed away also, and there still continued to be peace in the land. And this is not the only example. This is everywhere throughout the Book of Mormon, these socialistic, communalistic type of societies that tend to be blessed and tend to be extremely righteous, and people deal justly one with another. But that doesn't seem to be anything with what a typically red perspective or a conservative perspective would be. I mean, it seems completely anathema to that.
Well, yeah, and so it's fascinating. You brought up kind of the prosperity gospel and the pride cycle, and to be quite honest, it's also been fascinating to me that we don't focus on the pride cycle so much in the Mormon Church. I mean, it is the central message of the Book of Mormon that, the wealthier your society is, the further away it is from God, and that, this is the point which you fall apart. But we don't seem to focus on wealth as an evil, despite the fact that, the New Testament teaches us the love of money is the root of all evil. We've got, the wealthy youth that comes to Christ and asks him what he can do to get into heaven, and Christ tells him, sell all of your possessions, give them to the poor, and, the youth goes away sad.
To pass through the eye of a needle and all, yeah, I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. Everywhere. And I mean, it's not just these kind of pithy sayings either. It's, the early church in the Book of Acts is a communal church. We have Ananias and whatever his wife's name is, Sapphira, that they're both struck dead because they're trying not to give all of their possessions to the church. God literally kills them for not giving into this kind of communal structure. We've got in the early days of the church, when the United Order is established, Lehman Copley, who was a member in good standing at a huge farm, but he wasn't so happy with being a part of the United Order. Well, then he gets a reference in Doctrine and Covenants about it would be better for him to have a stone wrapped around his neck and thrown into the sea because he didn't want to join this communal order. Yeah. So, I mean, it's with the strongest of language that we talk about it in the scriptures about kind of an economic approach. So anyway, it's all of that as the background as to why I end up writing this up, because I've since now moved to Norway, and have spent 3 years here. And so taking, the scriptures at their word and the church doctrines and writings at their word and the covenants that we make for the law of consecration, wanted to do just a comparison statistically of, which society more closely matches what is described in the scriptures as a godlike society or a Christ-like society. Would it be Utah or Norway? And I guess I should say at the outset, I think this is a kind of a silly way to determine it, but it's going with what the scriptural definitions of a Christ-like society are. And, right. I want to hold it to that, and let's test it out then and see.
And these are statistics that are well backed up, conducted by government agencies, and these are the only indicators or methods of measurement by which we can test the happiness and the prosperity of a specific society. So, and you just include all of these most important statistics, which I think are just utterly fascinating. But just so people know what post to look for, I already said the title of it. Do you mind reading the first 2 paragraphs that you wrote there? Because that offers context into this whole thing and kind of like why you put it together.
Sure. I grew up in Utah and have lived in Oslo for the last 3 years. It has been fascinating to see an irreligious society that fits the description of Zion so much better than Utah. When dealing with religion, Mormons are taught to rely on feelings or the spirit to see if it is true. But in 2017, it's also pretty easy to test some of the claims and see if they bring about the desired result. In this thought experiment, I am not interested in the details of the ideologies we'll be comparing, but rather the measurable outcomes of the societies that they produce. So let's take a look at what Mormonism promises in terms of outcomes.
Very cool. So what did you find in conducting the study?
Well, yeah. So I mean, I had to first, of course, establish scripturally what it is that we're even looking to measure. So the two societies that we had a bit of description about, I took were the city of Enoch and the society in the Americas after Jesus had come in the Book of Mormon in 4th Nephi. And from those, established a list of what are promised as kind of the descriptors, the measurable outcomes of a Christ-like society. In fact, in the case of City of Enoch, such a righteous society that they are literally taken up whole into the bosom of God. They've passed the test of mortality. And so if we can approximate their outcomes, I mean, then we're doing pretty well, right? So that's
yeah.
That's the question. If we are following kind of, God's laws, what kind of society should we see? And so that's
absolutely. And, just to offer a little bit of historical context, too, in the progression of time when these revelations were given. Of course, the 4th Nephi, that is, after Jesus has come to America and in the Book of Mormon. But the city of Enoch, that's included in Moses, which is from the book of, or the Pearl of Great Price. And that wasn't revealed or canonized until the early to mid 1840s. So the church had been trying to practice communalism at some level multiple times. There was the United Order. There was Far West and Adam-on-Diamond that were set up as basically socialist communes. And then along comes the City of Enoch revelation from Moses chapter 7. And that's kind of where we see the evolution from Joseph's perspective of what communalism could look like versus what communalism is, how it's developed after they tried practicing it. So that's just a tiny bit of historical context.
Right, and it's worth saying that those beliefs continued on in the church, right? I mean, if you look at there's this thing floating around online that's a little in a poorly titled, but it's you can find it if you Google the Church's Proclamation on the Economy, which is not actually the title it had, but this was a talk given by the First Presidency under Brigham Young as they established the Zion Cooperative Mercantile Institution. Cooperative, keep that in mind. But they had this whole...
ZCMI is still a thing in Utah.
Still a thing in Utah, and the idea, as they founded ZCMI, they gave this talk about, how the disparity in wealth between the rich and the poor is one of the biggest threats, and how, the God system is not one of the blind pursuit of wealth, et cetera, and one of the biggest dangers is corporations having too much power and all of these things.
And now ZCMI is a shopping mall.
Yeah, exactly. There's irony. But this is just to say, I mean, these ideas were not just cherry-picked from the scriptures. I mean, this was a ripe vein of thought throughout the church going on into the 1900s. I mean, Brigham Young said his biggest fear for the saints was that they would get rich, wax fat, and kick themselves out of the kingdom and go to hell or something along those lines.
Interesting, a man who was one of the wealthiest men in 19th century America and who was quite rotund in his own build was scared of men getting too fat and happy with possessions. That's baffling to me.
Who would know better than he, the temptations that come?
Awesome. So let's discuss some of the findings that you pulled up here, and maybe we can go into the context of it, because you do kind of draw lines of difference and equality between Norway and Utah. Granted, Norway is a country, Utah is a state. They have different populations, different people, different social and economic pressures. But that being said, there still are some disparate statistics that come out when we compare them. And I think that's where this becomes a fascinating thought exercise. So Norway, the population is 5.2 million, whereas Utah is about 3 million. Religion is, I think, a big part of it. Obviously, Norway is known to be one of the least religious countries in Europe, possibly the world. You include the statistics, 29% of themselves counting themselves as believing in a church or deity, 26% being atheist, and 45% not being entirely certain, which I would just loop those in the none category. But of course, the Utah statistics are quite a bit different. Of course, Gallup poll found that 60% of Utah were considered very religious, which is more than half of the state's population is Mormon. And Gallup finds it to be routinely the most religious group of any category that the pollsters measure. So if we are looking just at the specific religious tenets of a given religion, let's say Mormonism, and trying to compare what the society should be, a religious society should fall more in line with the religious beliefs that are canonized in their text, whereas Norway is notoriously irreligious. And they don't tend to conform to any of the Mormon beliefs, but their society is structured much more in a way that is sanctioned in the Book of Mormon. So I just find a fascinating comparison between the two, just as far as religiosity goes.
Right. And just to, jump on that Norwegian religious statistic, it has very little relevance as far as I've been able to find in 3 years of living here in most people's life. They have a state-run church, which is the Church of Norway. It's basically Lutheranism. People will baptize their infants and maybe do a confirmation in their teens. That's it. Other than that, I don't actually know a single Norwegian outside of the Mormon Norwegians I know that go to church with any kind of regularity. So just to say, as far as I've been able to tell, these statistics may even be kind of optimistic for the Norway that I know is in their state of belief.
Fascinating. Okay. So do you want to walk us through a few of these statistics you found to be the most surprising when you found them?
Sure. So just to say, there were 6 basic statistics that we were looking at, drawn from the city of Enoch and the community in the time of 4th Nephi. Those were overall wealth distribution, crime rates, happiness, equality, and health. Again, I very much don't like the prosperity gospel, but it is one of those promises that, following the commandments leads to great wealth. So we can maybe lead off with that. The overall wealth of Norway is about 371 billion as a gross domestic product annually, or around $70,361 per person. Whereas for Utah, it's 105 billion, or 34,642 per person. So Norway is about twice as wealthy as Utah is when it's controlled for population.
But, we're kind of comparing apples and oranges in this case because, obviously Utah, like I said, is a state, Norway a country, and Norway has a socialist type of structure. Utah is, under the umbrella of American capitalism. And correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't Norway pull in oil money like Denmark and other Norwegian or other Scandinavian countries do?
Yeah, Norway, in fact, is the oil producer in the region, but of course what they've done is nationalize their oil. So it feeds into a sovereign fund controlled by the government, which helps to fund the welfare programs. So yes, but I think that's a direct link to the kind of economy that is described from the scriptures, would be one that's a communal resource that funds programs of health and leads to happiness.
No kid. That's obviously, and if you have a whole bunch of money that are taken from from an oil companies and pumped into this massive communal fund, that's going to distribute the wealth inherently. I wonder what the Utah economic statistics would look like if they were to strip the top 1% out of the skewing from the average per person GPD or GDP. Because obviously people who are extremely wealthy, of which many are affiliated with oil, they skew the statistics significantly. And I don't know how many oil barons exactly live in Utah, but I think that's kind of the case where, I know Alaska has a fund where the oil companies pump money into the citizen fund, basically. And if you live in Alaska for a certain amount of time, you gain access to this, and they just pay you a living stipend. And it sounds like it's kind of a similar way in Norway.
Yeah, it's definitely used to subsidize the public, and that's what it is. They don't have to worry about running it as a corporation with shares that they need to maximize profit or return on. It's run very much to maximize profit. They've invested in markets all around the world to protect it from economic turmoil, but the money is used for the people. It's not used for a corporation, and so. This just, again, paradoxically, in political science, there's a very well-established phenomenon called the resource curse, where if you're a nation that is predominantly blessed with a single natural resource, that actually erodes away democracy and stability. But not in the case of Norway, because they've done it differently than most countries. Most countries privatize and bring in foreign investors and, have companies running that resource. Norway did not do that and is doing quite well, thank you, in regards to democracy and overall happiness.
Fair enough. So let's get into some of these other measurements, because the overall wealth, that's just dollar amounts. That doesn't equate to actual happiness or to crime rates or to any of the other measures that are included in this. So let's go on to the wealth distribution. I think that's a fascinating point.
Right. So the wealth distribution, of course, is the concept that all of that wealth we just talked about, who is it in the hands of? Does it get spread out across society, or is it in, the top 1 or 5%? And there's a statistical model that is used to determine kind of the extent of the distribution or dispersion of income. It's called the Gini coefficients, which is GINI. And just to be upfront, I'm not a good statistician. I couldn't model this for you. It's available if you want to Google it. It'll give you all of the formulation behind it. But this is what is used by the UN, for example, to determine wealth distribution across the world. And it's the score that you receive from this coefficient is between 0 and 1, with 0 being perfect distribution, perfect equality of wealth, and a 1 being perfectly unequal. And so we can look then at the Gini coefficient for Norway and compare it to Utah. Norway's is 0.257, which is quite low. Remember, 0 would be perfect and a 1 would be imperfect. They're at 0.257, and Utah's at 0.320. Not to say that Utah is incredibly unequal. I mean, that would fall to, many societies in sub-Saharan Africa or whatnot, where, that you have a very wealthy 1% and a very unwealthy 99%. But Utah, again, is not scoring as well as Norway would be at distributing the wealth that they have, regardless of how much wealth it is, but just distributing the wealth that is available.
Right. This is an example of if let's say a single entity has 10 M&Ms and they take 9 M&Ms for themselves and give 1 to you, then they're going to score a 0.9 on this indicator. Whereas if they distribute them all, okay, everybody gets 1 M&M, or everybody gets 2 or 3 M&Ms just so it's equal, then they get a 0. And it looks like from this measurement, Utah is about 25% less equal or higher on the inequality scale than Norway is.
Right.
So that's just more for wealth. The next one you include is crime rates, and I think this is a very fascinating measurement.
Well, yeah. So again, the description from the Fourth Nephi Society goes to lengths to list the number of crimes and say that these things didn't exist anymore in this society that Christ himself had set up, and that people had stopped committing crimes. And so I thought, let's look at some of the crime statistics. 2 of the crimes that they mention in particular are murder and robbery, saying that these didn't exist anymore in these perfectly Christ-like societies. So comparing murder rates for Norway, it's at about 0.56 per 100,000 people. So a half a murder per 100,000 people, which a half a murder could be.
That they just cut off a leg. So that, I assume that's actually fairly low on a worldwide scale. Is that correct?
Yes. I mean, I didn't look at crime statistics for the entirety of the world, but Norway is known for having very low crime levels and for being a very safe country in which to live. Anecdotally, from living here, it's the kind of place where people are not worried about walking around late at night through the city. I had my parents here to visit, and we stopped at what is thought of as the most dangerous subway stop in Oslo. It was 2 a.m. We were getting back late from something, and there was nothing going on. It was totally quiet. There was, it was clean. There was nothing to be afraid of. We hung out there for 15 minutes waiting for our next train. I mean, it's the kind of place where I don't have concern about my kids being out and about. That's not to say crime doesn't happen. It's not to say that rape doesn't happen. Those things are here, of course, but it's known for being a very safe society.
It's not Rose Park or Foxborough or, West Ogden or something, or North Ogden, I should say. That's just an interesting measurement. But you also included the robbery statistic, which is baffling to me. Norway, we're looking at 29.7 per 100,000, whereas Utah is sitting at 44 per 100,000. 33% higher. That is a significant, even, controlling for population and socioeconomic status, that is still an incredibly high disparity between the two.
Right, and to be honest, I actually didn't want to use just robbery, because robbery, it has a strict legal definition. We're talking about actually somebody that is physically breaking in and taking from somebody. I don't know, some legal expert is going to hate that definition. I didn't look it up ahead of time, but it's we're not talking about just any theft. Robbery is an actual interaction where you have taken property from somebody else. But that doesn't include white-collar crime, for example. That's what I would have loved to look at, because it's known that Utah has a serious problem with white-collar crime. And it's known that...
Ponzi schemes and all
yes, the Ponzi schemes, and there's a term for the other one. It's...
multi-level marketing.
Well, there's that. I don't know that it feels like a crime, but not officially marked as affinity fraud. That's the one I'm thinking of. There's
affinity fraud. Okay.
Affinity fraud. So this is where you know someone who is defrauding you, and the Provo is known as having one of the highest rates of affinity fraud in the nation. So
right, he can't be a good guy. He's I go to church with him every Sunday. He can't be trying to scam me.
Right. Yeah. Unfortunately, I personally have family that have been taken into some of these things. So it's a thing that you deal with living in Utah is, a lot of schemes and fraud. But again, if we just stick to robberies, good old fashioned robberies, Utah is a good 30 some odd % higher than Norway is per 100,000 people.
Fascinating. The next statistic you go through is happiness, which is a hard indicator to try and measure by any standard. But there are a few measurements that can be done. There are these happiness surveys, of course. There are, I'm trying to think of what is, there's a certain, I think it's Burma that is trying to, judge and rate their population based on a happiness statistic. But of course, it's something that's hard to quantify. But you included happiness surveys and suicide rates. Do you want to walk us through those?
Yeah, sure. So, and this is just to say, if you look up like a global happiness survey, you'll see they actually do try very hard to be scientific about what they are measuring to include in the happiness survey. So the global one that I reference here for Norway, I believe is a much more accurate reflection than the one that I ended up referencing for Utah, because that one was put together by, as far as I can tell, a real estate company or something. But, okay. But let's just say that both of them ranked highly in these kinds of happiness surveys. Norway was ranked recently as the number one for global happiness, and they fold into that all kinds of things about people's outlook on life, their experience with crime, their ability to get education for their kids. They fold all kinds of things into this to determine what is it really like to live there. And Norway is listed as the number one.
And of course, these surveys are inherently very subjective, but happiness is a subjective measurement. But it's doing so on and measuring in a statistically significant population. If you're gathering in, thousands or tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of surveys from around the world, you're going to really begin to see some, trends start to emerge out of those statistics.
Right. And Utah also ranked well. It's ranked second happiest U.S. state. But this is...
I wonder if we could measure that with, consumption of antidepressants, Norway versus Utah. I wonder if that would be on the happiness survey.
Yeah, and that was actually one that I considered including. I ultimately discarded the depression or use of antidepressants for a couple of reasons. One was that there's a well-established link between daylight and depression rates. rates. And of course, Norway being very far north has much less daylight and would be expected to have higher depression rates. There's also, it's a completely different health model between the two. And I will say that as far as mental health is concerned, I haven't been overly impressed with Norway's approach to mental health. It hasn't been quite as standardized as some of the other health services. I would think that it's a little more difficult to get in and get antidepressants, for example. So you might find Utah has quite a bit more antidepressant use, but I wouldn't necessarily trust that number comparing it to Norway, because there's probably people that need them that aren't getting them or as likely to. So anyway, there's a number of reasons why I ended up not including depression rates. You could look into those figures and decide what you think they mean. But one that seems very cut and dried is suicide rates. So this is, it either happened or it didn't. They've either committed suicide or they haven't. And, with all of the discussion over the last couple of years trying to bring attention to suicide rates in Utah, it seemed like something to really put into this analysis here. So for Norway, 10.9 suicides per 100,000 people. For Utah, 24.5. So 2.5 times.
Yeah, almost 2.5 times the amount. That is a stark disparity. Wow.
Yes. No, and it's, again, it's a terrible thing to even need to be looking at, but it's a significant problem in Utah. And, according to the happiness survey, where they're the second happiest state in the nation, you wouldn't expect such a high suicide rate. But they actually do have a very high suicide rate, even compared across the states, which again should maybe bring into question the methodology of that happiness survey to say, how is it that they are both incredibly happy and committing suicide at a high rate? No kidding. Something to be thinking about.
Interesting. There's so many folds wrapped up into what is considered happiness and mental health, and trying to quantify an entire population's mental health is always going to be a challenge for statisticians to try and grapple with. But I think that what we're looking at, the measurements, the very simplistic measurements we're looking at right now, are at least a start for understanding. And even if you do try and control for daylight, if you try and control for very socioeconomic trends, still having a rate that's 2.5 times a comparative size population, that's concerning, to say the least.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope that the more people that hear this statistic, the more that, it will be paid attention to, and that something will change in the way that we are addressing mental health, and in particular amongst Mormons, making sure that they are understanding what are the driving forces behind suicide. Again, that you wouldn't expect that to be a significant indicator amongst a Christ-like population. Suicide, despair, these, feelings of there's nowhere else to turn. That's not how you would think you would describe, a Christ-like society. So I would love people to pay more attention to that figure in particular.
Fair enough. So let's move on to the equality statistic. I find this to be very fascinating because, historically speaking, Mormonism is very misogynistic in its perspective of who is the career person versus who is the homemaker. They have a very 1950s ideal. Men go out there, the breadwinners, they get the jobs, they provide for the family, while the wife stays at home and has a ton of babies. And it's interesting to see that same perspective that seems to exist and is taught in everyday, church meetings is enshrined in these statistics. And do you want to read through the equality comparison that you did?
Sure, and just as a little bit of background here, so obviously the scriptures describing the city of Enoch and 4th Nephi did not talk about equality for women. They just talked about there not being any manner of ites, that there were no divisions among the people, etc. And who knows from these mythical time periods what that actually meant? As far as we know from early church history, that meant, but still not black people. But who knows? But I left out the wealth disparities, the classes, because we handled that under the equality above of the wealth distribution. So that part I felt like was taken care of. The race issue seemed like it just was not really going to figure into this. We already kind of know where those things stand with the church in Utah and the rocky history there. But what I think people don't know a lot about is this incredible gender disparity that is going on in economic terms between Norway and Utah. So just looking at Norway is considered to be the third most gender equal country globally. There are a number of statistics that go into that. I didn't share all of them. The ones that I shared were that 76% of Norwegian women that are of working age are part of the national labor market. So 76% of Norwegian women are working, 80% of Norwegian men. So a little bit higher for men, but fairly close. As far as the remuneration that they receive, for every $1 earned by a woman, a man earns $1.27. Still not perfect either. You would expect with women having the same kinds of education, the same kinds of jobs, there to be more parity there. But that's enough to put them in the third most gender equal country. So that tells you kind of how bad this is around the world. And then further about...
I can also hear an MRA listener who is, coining an email right now. Oh, those pay gap statistics are utterly bunk. And a lot of them are very relevant and very accurate. And I understand that there's some subjectivity to these statistics, and as far as the gender pay gap goes, but just looking at it by a similar measurement, Utah does not do any better than Norway does by a long shot.
No, I mean, that's why I did throw in kind of three different ways of looking at this. I understand that there's some questions about how to calculate that and, what a woman's working life looks like compared to a man just naturally, but regardless of any of that, I mean, there are things that you can look at that are very objective, like the number of women that receive a university degree, which in Norway is actually a bit on the high end of that. So 63% of the bachelor degrees that are awarded go to women, meaning that more women than men are ending up getting a university degree.
Which may go to say that more men are doing vocational and technical degrees. The typical jobs that we would think that are men's jobs, driving garbage trucks and welders and stuff like that, that typically we don't see women in roles of. So I'm not surprised to see a higher level of bachelor degrees going to women. I think that's just my own take on it.
And, within the country, of course, we can kind of argue about what exactly each of these mean. But where it gets really interesting is comparing between Norway and Utah, because we take those same three measures, and there's a very stark difference. So even if you don't think of them as, worthwhile statistics in and of themselves, the difference between the two is enough for you to start to have questions, right? So, we went from Norway being the third most gender equal country globally to Utah being the worst U.S. state for gender equality.
Yeah, ranked at bottom 5th or 50th. That's it. Bam. That's the bottom of the barrel.
Right at the very bottom. And some of the measures that feed into that statistic are because, for example, only 40% of women are working compared to 76% in Norway. So less than half of the women in Utah that you would expect to be working are working, whereas 76% of men are working. So again, very similar to the Norwegian statistic, men are working, but women are not. 40% of them are working.
Which has to have a huge economic impact as well, especially on just the mean household incomes as well. I mean, if we have significant less number of people in the workforce who are of eligible working age, then there is just less people with jobs, and inherently that's going to have a degrading economic impact.
Well, and a degrading impact on quality as well, right? I mean, you're effectively removing, half of the potential competition. Well, if we believe in competition, it brings about the best results. What quality of workers are you getting if you're missing half of the potential workforce from even applying in the first place?
Yeah, no kidding.
So, and then again, some of these other figures, for every $1 earned by a woman, a man earns $1.30 compared to $1.27 in Norway. And then this one is a big deal right now. I've seen a lot of newspaper articles written about this. 47% of bachelor's degrees going to women. Again, this is at the very bottom for the United States. We are one of the worst states for this.
I mean, and that's a self-perpetuating cycle. You have less women who are in the workforce, you have less women who are getting bachelor degrees. You're just going to have a less inherently, women are going to have less of an impact on society when that happens.
Right. Yeah. All right. So that takes us to our last indicator here, right?
Yeah.
So this one is the health one. And this one, I pulled straight from 4th Nephi, where it talks about in the society, they heal the sick, they cause the lame to walk, the blind to receive their sight, the deaf to hear, all of these things, which, of course, if you wanted to take it from a miraculous point of view, this means, a lot of blessings were given and people were healed. And quite honestly, that point of view is what got me interested in the health statistics in the first place, because it was pointed out to me at some point, well, hey, do we see a statistical difference in health outcomes in Utah compared to any other comparable state, for example? Because we have priesthood members and home teachers and heads of households that are going into hospitals every day in Utah and giving blessings. Wouldn't you expect a pretty significant improvement in surgical outcomes, in, the lower infant mortality rate? Wouldn't you expect, people to have more remission of cancer? All kinds of statistics that you should be able to look at, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, if that is the case, it's completely washed out by the private healthcare system that we have in the U.S., because Norway is doing better for health as well. So just a couple of those statistics. Life expectancy in Norway, it's 80 years for males, 84 for females, versus 78.2 for males and 81.4 for females. So both males and females have a higher or a longer life expectancy in Norway than they do in Utah. And then this one is a bit shocking. Infant mortality rates. So this is one of the measurements. I work in public health. That's what I do for a living, is I work in a bunch of less developed countries trying to help them with their health systems. And one of the indicators that is most important is infant mortality rates, because if you can save babies, it's a great proxy indicator for the overall capacity of your health system. And so if we look at Norway, it's a very low infant mortality rate, 2.5 babies per 1,000 that are not making it past a certain period of life. In Utah, it's over double that, 5.82 per 1,000.
That is a shocking statistic right there, especially for a society that champions itself. We have some of the best healthcare with the competition that is here in trying to get the best healthcare available for everybody, when it turns out a socialist healthcare has half of the infant mortality rate of Utah's healthcare system. That is stunning to see the difference between those two.
Well, and just a comment on that, because this is recent news. So Texas recently had changed a number of its legal aspects of who can receive care and from where, notably not allowing for women to receive services from Planned Parenthood. This plummeted Texas's maternal mortality rate, so pregnant women. They are the worst maternal mortality rate in the developed world in Texas.
In the developed world.
The entirety of the developed world. Texas has the worst maternal mortality rate. So,
if hurricanes weren't a problem already, the babies aren't even living to experience the hurricanes now. Great.
Right. So, again, if we wanted to talk about it not in terms of miracles, but rather in terms of economic models, if you're trying to have the best health outcomes, it appears that the private healthcare system that we have in the U.S., where it's dependent on your employer and your insurance, and there's very little in the way of a social safety net, that leads to worse health outcomes. So again, from an economic model standpoint, you would think that Mormons would be champions for a universal healthcare system like they have everywhere else in the developed world.
And I think so much of what we're discussing here, especially when it comes to the equality, the health, and probably the happiness spectrum, a lot of it has to do with just the teachings of the church, because Utah is the notoriously most Mormon place in the entire world. And at some level, we have to wonder if there is causal links between some of the statistics versus some of the teachings of the church. We see infant mortality rates that are that much higher. Well, women in Utah are having more babies. I was able to pull up this article from the archive, Salt Lake Tribune articles, and this was actually published back in 2010, so the statistics are a little bit outdated, but the trend still holds. And they quote Pam Perlich, who is an economist at University of Utah, and when she says, quote, "That's because we are more connected to the outside world now. Utah used to be an isolated, tiny place. As we become more connected to the outside world, we tend to resemble it more over time. Utah lags national trends by about 2 or 2.5 generations." And what she's talking about there is Utahns are, considered to be the big family type of religion, kind of a quiverful type of religion, but that has been slowly shrinking. It used to be that people had a perspective of 8 or 9 or 10 kids as a big family. Now, the national average, if you have 4 or 5 kids, that's considered a big family. But it does go through some interesting statistics here, and granted, a lot of these are, like I said, a little outdated, but they're still relevant. Because of its many children, Utah has the youngest average median age of any state, which is 28.8 years old, compared with the national average of 36.8 years old. Let's see. Utah has the nation's largest average household size, which is 3.17 people, as opposed to a national average of 2.63 people. Utah has the highest ratio of children to adult workers, 52.2 per 100 workers, compared to the national average of 38.6 per 100 workers. It has the highest percentage of households with 1 or more children, which is 42.9%, as opposed to 32% as the national average. I mean, so many of the economic constraints that we may be pointing to here do have a bit to do with how just kind of the general teaching structure of the church and how many kids Mormons have. And I think that can hold a lot of causal definition in some of these statistics we're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, again, we don't even need to look closely at what the church teaches if we look instead at the outcomes, right? The outcomes don't lie. If whatever the church is doing works, you will see it in the outcomes. You would see it in terms of, education rates. You would see it in terms of health. You would see it in terms of, reduced suicides, whatever it is. I mean, this is when you have those outcomes, then as a scientist, you can go backwards and start to look more closely at, what is going into it. Well, what aspects of Mormonism lead to these outcomes? But this is like the cherry picking, or the low hanging fruit anyway. As, somebody doing any kind of scientific inquiry, we can just look right now and say, well, what's going on of interest in these kind of outcomes and these statistics? And yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, you could, if your goal, as I think it is in Mormonism, is to establish Zion and to approximate, the city of Enoch on earth, then you would want to see the society approaching that, right? And if you don't see that, that's already enough information to say, well, something's wrong.
Yeah.
Right? You've set out what you think should happen based on this intervention, the intervention being, the gospel in this community. And if it's not happening, well, then there's something about your intervention that is not working. So
absolutely.
Yeah, that's where I came at it.
And having the comparative statistics of Norway as opposed to, the Zion in the Great Basin, we do have to try and tease out where some of that causality lies. And when we're looking at these socioeconomic statistics and trying to say, okay, so why does Norway score better on all of these reasons? What are all of these categories? What are the differences between Norway and Utah? And obviously, there are significant differences just in religiosity, in the various economic pressures, in the type of government that's done. But I don't know if there's like a single metric that we can point to that would, that we can say this is why Utah scores so much lower than Norway. It seems like it's an amalgamation of all of these different small pressures put together.
No, of course, and it would be. I mean, this is why my title for it was an armchair experiment. I mean, this is me spending a morning Googling some statistics and just comparing them, partially taking, Mormonism's promises at their word and saying, well, this is the society we would produce. And then me looking and saying, well, did you? But of course, yeah. I wouldn't see this then anywhere as some kind of scientific approach. At this point, we would then dive into things and look at, okay, what actually is going on and what is different between these societies. One way to potentially control for it is to look at the Mormon population within Norway and compare that to a strong Mormon population in Utah, and then see how, what the differences might be, instead of lumping in all of these other groups that fall into your national or state level statistics, et cetera, et cetera. There would be ways to get at a better understanding of this, but really, I just wanted to flag up some of these issues, because for me, as a believing member for, 10 years of my adult life, and trying to teach gospel doctrine lessons and be an elders quorum instructor and educate my children on, what are the things that we should value, I had a lot of values that I pulled from the scriptural teachings and from what I would expect from the New Testament or the Book of Mormon, and didn't see those things reflected in our culture or our society in Utah. Which was very frustrating to me. It was a constant source of frustration, and it was ultimately one of the reasons where I realized I can't raise my kids here. This, it's, as a believer, I thought it was a poisonous society to be a part of. And this is, all you Utah lovers out there, I also love Utah. Utah has some of the most beautiful nature there is. I have great family there, wonderful friends. But as a society, there's some significant problems there, and I didn't want to play the odds with my kids as to where to raise them.
Absolutely. It's not so much that what we're discussing here is just what we're seeing that the church produces, but what we're discussing is exactly opposite to what the Book of Mormon and the Pearl of Great Price try to put forward as the perfect society. These societies that were actually, voiped up to heaven because they were so righteous, in 4th Nephi and in, the city of Enoch. These were... If you are indeed a religious society and you're trying to be the most, righteous society, you should do whatever it says in your religious book that says that these people were doing in order to become the most righteous society. And you would assume that the more the society adheres to the specific religion that's trying to get to these super holy cities, then we would see those various measurements increase. But it seems to be an almost inverse relationship between the two, which I find to be surprising at some level, but also not that surprising, because I grew up in Utah too. I know Mormons. I know the Mormon mindset. I was Mormon for the first third of my life at this point, and I see kind of the general tone and the feel of the society. Granted, I've never visited Norway, so I lived there, so I don't know what it's like there, but I know kind of some of the various trends that I saw in my day-to-day life in Utah versus what I see outside of Utah, and these statistics do really kind of make sense to me. So if you were to kind of sum up what you learned from this, is there anything that you'd kind of want to leave us with in considering all of these statistics that you found?
Just to say again, it's a little bit of a silly exercise. I realize that, and I'm not trying to stand entirely on this and convert everybody to, a social democracy or something. But the sticking point for me was, we have an approach outlined supposedly in the scriptures and from Joseph Smith and from Jesus and the early apostles. There's a specific way that they would have structured the economy, and it isn't capitalism. Capitalism succeeds and does a wonderful job of generating wealth, but it does it because it, I think, harnesses what the scriptures would describe as the natural man, right? It's, every man out for himself, and that works because it's a thing that people are willing to do, and that works great. But it's shocking to see members of the church that then take that to mean this is God's plan, but it should be capitalism. Well, I bet that makes no sense whatsoever from what we can see and study in the scriptures. So, fine. Yeah. Anyway, that's why I dived into it and took a look at it. To me, it's just kind of fun to play around with. I do love it here in Norway. It's been an excellent place to live. There are a lot of wonderful things about it. There are, of course, problems. It's, not the total utopia that it seems like if all you ever do is look at Reddit, but it is a wonderful place. And I think that Utah could stand taking a look at itself in some of these numbers and trying to see, what could we do to improve health outcomes and reduce suicides and, improve gender equality. Those would be great efforts to put in place and should be endorsed by the predominant religion there.
And if not imposed by them, because it seems like every time Mormons try to impose communalism, bad things happen and people die. So
no,
if not imposed,
I'm
then
not
at least
promoting that either.
yeah, I mean, at least endorse it. You don't have to impose it. You don't have to create the structure, but at least endorse it. Don't oppose it the way that it is now. So I think that's a really solid takeaway. Mike, do you have anything that you want to plug before we call it a night?
No, so if this has been interesting at all to talk about kind of cultural differences between places, so I have in the past had a Coolture podcast that my friend Enzo and I run this podcast we call the Coolture cast, COOL.
I like it.
We're planning to bring it back. We've done about 4 episodes, which you can easily find, and I'll send a link to you. But then otherwise we now have our improved podcasting equipment. We'd be happy to dive into it. This is an exploration of cultural differences, not just within Mormonism, but I travel a lot for my work. I work in Asia, the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa. My co-host is from Uruguay. He's married to a Norwegian. He's lived in Spain. And for us, it's diving into kind of these differences between groups and where they come from. What do they mean? What does it mean for this, global society, which we are inching more and more towards as, the internet grows and borders break down and people are having relationships across the planet? What does that mean for us? So anyway, Coolture cast, it should be coming more episodes very soon.
Awesome. Of course, there will be a link to that, as well as the Reddit post that you made in the show notes if anyone wants to chase this down. And they can also look for your posts under the Reddit handle of WWEnus. I really like that. Mike,
I'm so glad you didn't pronounce it Weenus.
Weenus? I should have. It's like whoa, Weenus.
No, it is. WWEnus. You got it.
All right, WWEnus, and of course, Mike, it's been a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for joining me and for discussing this armchair discussion that we had.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was great.
All right, that's going to do it for the episode today. Once again, I wanted to thank Mike for coming on and sharing this little piece of research that he had put together on the ExMormon subreddit. And of course, you will find links to everything necessary in the show notes, as I said in the interview. So thank you once again, Mike. On to the final portion of the episode. We do have a couple new patrons to thank. First, we have a pledge edit by Zimu X Zenu Jr. Thank you for that. And we have new patrons, Chris Chigbrow. I like to think it's a Chigbro. Yeah. And then Brusky Platypus. Brusky Platypus. Yeah, Brusky Platypus. And then Jonathan. Thank you, all of you, to all of our patrons. And of course, thank you so much to the new patrons. And I really hope that you enjoy the extra content that you get in the Patreon only feed. This episode, of course, does have it's just a regular episode posted up, but there is an extra episode tacked on this week that will be the next installment of reading through an address to all believers in Christ. So I hope you enjoy that. Next week's episode is going to be a bit untraditional. I still have yet to record it and put it together, but I am in hopes that I will be able to record with some of the people at the John Whitmer Historical Association conference, which I am amidst the first day of attendance at the time that you're listening to this, at the time this airs anyway. And so hopefully next week is just going to be a discussion interview, possibly with Joe Geisner, possibly with a couple other historians. I'm not sure who I'm going to be able to snag, as I'm not actually there right now, so I'm not sure who's going to be there. But all in all, as I said last episode, the opportunity to go to this John Whitmer Historical Association conference is going to arm me with a ton of new information and a ton of new tangents to research and new rabbit holes to dive down. And I'm going to be bringing all of that to you, the listeners. So with that said, thank you so much to the patrons who support and make it so I'm able to go to these conferences and arm myself more with more Mormon history and more information. And next week is going to be who knows what. It might just be a topic about the discussion of Nauvoo. It might just be Mormon history in general. I don't know what conversation we're going to get into, but it is sure to be something completely different than what we usually do. So, that being said, let's shut it down for the evening. We do have the necessary people to thank, as we do every week, who make sure that everything runs on the back end. First off, thank you so much to Julianne for running the Facebook and Twitter handles. The conversation is active over there, so be sure to hop on a Facebook and Twitter and follow us and give us a like at Naked Mormonism. Thank you so much to Jason Camo. He created the musical that Thank you so much to Jason Camo. He created the music going into your ears right now. Be sure to go to aloststateofmind.com to hear all of his 19 albums that he has on there. They're really amazing. Thank you to Craig Keeling for creating the artwork that's used in this show. Be sure to go to weirdmormonshit.com to see his blog there. Legal services for this podcast are provided by Andrew Torres of the Opening Arguments podcast, as well as the co-host of Opening Arguments. Thank you so much, Andrew, for keeping us on the up and up. Thank you, of course, once again, to the patrons for the third time this episode. You guys keep the show going on the back end. You guys keep the show running in the black. And then, most importantly, without all of the listeners, this would just be me yelling at a computer screen. So, thank you most of all, once again, to the amazing listeners for lending me your ear. I hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism podcast. You know, in stumbling around a bunch of old newspapers, you can't help but happen on some fun articles, okay? Here's a fun one, and it was titled Curious Accident that I happened upon. I don't even remember which newspaper because I've been reading so many of them this week. Here it is, Curious Accident. On Tuesday last, a horse ran away in the high street, Bedford, where this Mormon debate was going on, with a cartload of bricks, and galloped down the street at a tremendous pace. Oh dear. Upon reaching the bridge, the axle tree broke. The wheels flew off and the cart fell with a sudden shock, which threw bricks over the horse, covering him to all appearance in his last brick grave. Oh, that's sad, right? A horse lost control and went galloping down the high street, and the axle tree broke on the wagon, and all of the bricks covered the horse and looked like it killed him. But there's another line. Assistance was rendered, and it was discovered that the horse had entirely escaped injury, not having received even a broken knee. End quote. This is fun, right? This is a fun little article. It's just a random ass thing that I saw in there. And, you know, just in perusing through all of these articles, you're going to happen upon fun little stuff like this. If you're perusing newspapers.com or the British Newspaper Archive or any of these, you know, massive databases of archived newspapers, you're going to find fun stuff like this. The point I want to make is this was in Bedford when the missionary was there. You know, and Heisenberg was asking for a provable miracle. Well, one could look back on this and post hoc rationalize that this horse was saved by miracle, right? He was covered in bricks. They lost control and it looked like it killed the horse, but a miracle was rendered and the horse got up without even a single injury. Wow, isn't that a beautiful faith-building type of story? I mean, nobody's making this argument, but see how you can post hoc rationalize simple, mundane occurrences like this and say, oh, that sounded like a miracle? Unfortunately, Mormon history is rife with these same kinds of things. The preceding podcast is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2017, all rights reserved.